Picture this. It's 3 a.m. in the year 1347. You're lying on a straw mattress, listening to rats scurrying in the walls, when suddenly you hear scratching at your door. Your heart stops. Not because you're afraid of burglars, mind you. In medieval times, locked doors were more of a suggestion anyway. No, you're terrified because everyone knows that demons prefer the hours between midnight and dawn to collect souls, and you definitely forgot to say your protective prayers before bed. Welcome to medieval Europe, where going to sleep wasn't just about getting rest. It was about surviving the night in a world absolutely crawling with supernatural threats, malevolent spirits, and cosmic forces that could damn your soul faster than you could say, Hail Mary. And if you think modern anxiety is bad, try living in an era where sneezing the wrong way could indicate demonic possession, where your dreams were considered legal evidence in court cases, and where the simple act of walking backwards might accidentally summon the devil himself. The medieval mind didn't just believe in the supernatural. It was completely, utterly, magnificently obsessed with it. And honestly, who could blame them? This was a time before electric lights, before modern medicine, before anyone understood why milk spoiled, or why babies sometimes died in their sleep. When you can't explain the world through science, you explain it through stories. And medieval stories were absolutely wild. Let's start with the thing that terrified medieval people more than war, plague, or even bad ale: the wild hunt. Imagine you're walking home late one evening, maybe from the local tavern where you've been complaining about taxes or debating whether turnips count as real food. Suddenly, you hear it. The sound of hunting horns echoing through the forest, followed by the thundering of hooves and the baying of supernatural hounds. But here's the thing. There's no hunting party. At least, not one made of living people. The wild hunt was believed to be a ghostly procession of hunters, led by various figures depending on your local mythology. Sometimes it was Odin, the Norse god, still searching for worthy souls. Sometimes it was King Arthur, doomed to hunt until the end of times. In Germanic regions, it might be a cursed nobleman who had hunted on the Sabbath and was now condemned to eternal pursuit. The hunters rode skeletal horses. Their hounds were the size of calves, with eyes like burning coals, and their quarry wasn't deer or boar. It was human souls. The rules around the wild hunt were very specific and absolutely terrifying. If you heard the horns, you had to immediately throw yourself face down on the ground and pray. Looking up at the hunters meant instant death, or being swept up to join their eternal chase. Some versions said you could survive by offering them food, particularly bread and ale, which they would accept before thundering past. Others insisted that wearing iron or carrying a bit of churchyard earth would protect you. But the most disturbing part? The wild hunt wasn't just a story to scare children. Adult men, respected merchants, even clergy members would swear they had heard the horns and felt the earth shake beneath phantom hooves. Court records from medieval Germany include testimonies from witnesses who claim to have seen the spectral hunters. One chronicler from the 12th century wrote about an entire village that barricaded themselves indoors for 3 days after multiple people reported hearing the hunt pass through their forest. The really unsettling thing about the wild hunt is how widespread it was. Every culture in medieval Europe had some version of it. The English called it the wild hunt. The French knew it as the chasse galerie. Germans spoke of the wilde Jagd. The details varied, but the core terror remained the same. Somewhere, in the space between the living world and the dead, there was a hunting party that never stopped, never rested, and was always listening for the next soul to join their ranks. And if that wasn't enough to keep you awake, there was always the fear of the nightmare. Not the kind of bad dream we call nightmares today, the actual nightmare. A demonic entity that was believed to physically visit people while they slept. Medieval people were absolutely convinced that a creature called the nightmare would sit on their chests while they slept, causing difficulty breathing, terrible dreams, and a crushing sensation that could last for hours. The word nightmare literally comes from night and mare, an Old English word for a female evil spirit. This wasn't sleep paralysis, at least not in their understanding. This was a malevolent being with a specific agenda. The nightmare was described as a heavy, oppressive presence that would creep into bedrooms through keyholes, cracks in doors, or even down chimneys. Once inside, it would position itself on the sleeper's chest, growing heavier throughout the night. Victims would wake up gasping, with the sensation that something had been pressing down on them. Some reported seeing a dark figure, usually female, sitting on their body or standing at the foot of their bed. But the nightmare wasn't just interested in causing discomfort. Medieval belief held that these entities could steal your breath, your dreams, or even your soul. They were particularly drawn to people who had sinned, who had eaten too much before bed, or who had slept in the wrong position. Yes, apparently even your sleeping posture could attract demons. The protective measures against nightmares were elaborate and varied by region. Some people placed iron objects under their beds or hung horseshoes above their doors. Others created nightmare knots, special braids made from horsehair that were supposedly too complex for the demons to untangle. In parts of England, people would place a piece of bread under their pillows, believing that the nightmare would become distracted by counting the crumbs and forget to torment the sleeper. Churches sold special blessed amulets designed specifically to ward off nightmares. Prayer books included specific incantations to be recited before bed. Some monks developed entire rituals involving holy water, salt circles around the bed, and the recitation of protective psalms. The more devout would sleep wearing crucifixes or keep a piece of consecrated bread nearby. But perhaps the most telling detail about the nightmare belief is how seriously it was taken by medical authorities. Medieval physicians wrote extensively about nocturnal oppression and prescribed treatments ranging from herbal remedies to bloodletting. They believed that certain foods, particularly cheese, meat, or ale consumed before bed, could make a person more susceptible to nightmare attacks. Some doctors recommended sleeping on one's right side, while others insisted that keeping the bedroom completely dark would prevent the creatures from finding their victims. The fear of nightmares was so pervasive that it influenced architecture. Medieval bedrooms often included small alcoves or cupboards where protective items could be stored. Beds themselves were sometimes built with specific features designed to ward off evil spirits. The four-poster bed, so associated with medieval luxury, actually served a practical purpose. The posts could hold curtains that created a protective barrier, and many people would hang blessed objects or herbs from the frame. And then there were the revenants. If the wild hunt was terrifying and nightmares were disturbing, revenants were absolutely horrifying. These weren't your garden variety ghosts floating around and rattling chains. Revenants were the walking dead, corpses that had returned from the grave with unfinished business, and that business was usually revenge. Medieval people believed that certain individuals could return from death if they had died violently, if they had committed serious sins, or if they had been buried improperly. But unlike modern zombie stories, revenants retained their intelligence, their memories, and their grudges. They looked exactly as they had in life, except for a few disturbing details. Their skin might be unnaturally pale or slightly blue. Their movements could be eerily silent, and their touch was said to be ice cold. Revenant encounters were reported throughout medieval Europe, and they followed a disturbingly consistent pattern. The dead person would return to their former home or to the place where they had died. They would seek out specific people, usually family members, enemies, or anyone who had wronged them in life. And they wouldn't just appear once. Revenants were persistent. They would return night after night until their grievances were resolved, or until someone took drastic action to stop them. The accounts of revenant encounters are surprisingly detailed and specific. A 12th century chronicle from England tells the story of a man named William, who died suddenly and returned to terrorize his wife. According to the account, William would appear in their bedroom every night, speaking to his wife about their marriage and demanding that she join him in death. The woman became ill from fear and lack of sleep. The local priest was called in, but even holy water and prayers seemed to have no effect. The situation escalated when William began appearing to other villagers, always at night, always with the same cold touch and unnaturally pale appearance. People reported that he would knock on doors, call out names, and even enter homes uninvited. The fear became so widespread that families would barricade their doors after sunset and refuse to answer any knocks, even from living neighbors. The resolution, according to the chronicle, was both brutal and telling. The villagers decided to exhume William's body, which they found to be uncorrupted despite having been buried for weeks. This was considered proof of his supernatural state. They drove a wooden stake through his heart, beheaded the corpse, and burned the remains. Only then did the nightly visitations stop. Stories like this weren't isolated incidents. Medieval chronicles are filled with similar accounts, each following the same pattern of identification, escalation, and violent resolution. The consistency of these stories across different regions and time periods suggests that revenant encounters were a widely accepted part of medieval reality. The fear of revenants influenced burial practices throughout Europe. Bodies were sometimes buried with stones placed on the chest to prevent them from rising. In some regions, corpses were buried face down, so that if they tried to dig their way out, they would only burrow deeper into the earth. Others were buried with iron nails driven through their feet to pin them in place. Certain types of deaths were considered especially likely to produce revenants. Suicides were almost guaranteed to return, which is why the bodies of those who took their own lives were often buried at crossroads or outside consecrated ground. People who died violently, particularly murder victims, were also at high risk, and anyone who had been excommunicated from the church was practically certain to become a problem after death. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of revenant belief was the idea that these creatures could create more of their kind. Medieval accounts describe revenants who would attack living people, and anyone who died from such an attack would also return as a revenant. This created the terrifying possibility of supernatural epidemics, where one returned corpse could eventually populate an entire region with the walking dead. The connection between disease and revenants wasn't lost on medieval people. During plague outbreaks, reports of revenant sightings would often increase dramatically. This makes sense from a modern perspective. People dying suddenly and in large numbers, mass graves that might not be properly consecrated, communities in chaos and fear. All of these factors would contribute to an atmosphere where supernatural explanations seemed not just plausible but inevitable. And speaking of disease, medieval people had developed an intricate and absolutely terrifying set of beliefs about how illness was connected to supernatural forces. They lived in constant fear of the evil eye, the idea that certain people could cause sickness, death, or misfortune simply by looking at you with malicious intent. The evil eye wasn't just a casual superstition. It was considered a real and present danger that required constant vigilance. People believed that individuals who possessed the evil eye could cause crops to fail, milk to sour, children to fall ill, and livestock to die, all through the power of their gaze. And the most disturbing part, sometimes people didn't even know they had this power. You could accidentally curse someone just by looking at them while feeling jealous or angry. The symptoms of an evil eye curse were varied and often matched what we would now recognize as common illnesses or bad luck. Sudden headaches, unexplained fatigue, a run of minor accidents, animals acting strangely, food spoiling faster than usual. All of these could be signs that someone had given you the evil eye. But more serious manifestations could include serious illness, business failures, or even death. Protecting yourself from the evil eye required a complex array of charms, rituals, and behavioral modifications. Blue glass beads were worn as jewelry, sewn into clothing, or hung in homes because the color blue was believed to deflect malevolent gazes. Mirrors were sometimes incorporated into protective charms, with the idea that they would reflect the evil back to its source. Iron objects, particularly horseshoes and nails, were considered especially effective. But personal protection was just the beginning. Entire communities developed elaborate social protocols designed to minimize the risk of evil eye incidents. People were careful about how they complimented each other, especially when it came to children, livestock, or crops. A seemingly innocent comment like, "What a beautiful baby," could be interpreted as a potential curse if the speaker's tone seemed even slightly envious. This led to the development of specific verbal formulas designed to neutralize potential evil eye effects. When giving a compliment, people would often add phrases like, "God bless," or "May no harm come to it," as a protective buffer. Some communities required that any praise be immediately followed by a specific prayer or gesture to prevent supernatural backlash. The identification of evil eye practitioners was a source of constant community tension. Certain physical characteristics were considered warning signs. People with unusual eye colors, particularly very light blue or green eyes, were often viewed with suspicion. Individuals with prominent eyebrows, deep-set eyes, or asymmetrical features might be accused of possessing the evil eye. And anyone who seemed to have an unusual amount of good or bad luck could find themselves labeled as either a victim or a practitioner. The social consequences of being accused of having the evil eye were severe. Such individuals might be ostracized from their communities, refused service by merchants, or even driven out of town entirely. In extreme cases, suspected evil eye practitioners could face physical violence or accusations of witchcraft. But the evil eye wasn't the only way that supernatural forces could affect your health. Medieval people also lived in terror of curses, which were believed to be much more powerful and specific than the evil eye. While the evil eye was often accidental and general in its effects, curses were deliberate, targeted, and potentially devastating. Curses could be cast by anyone with the right knowledge, but certain individuals were considered especially dangerous. Wise women, herbalists, and anyone with a reputation for supernatural knowledge were viewed with a mixture of respect and fear. A person skilled in healing was also potentially skilled in harming, and the line between medicine and magic was often unclear. The most feared curse casters were those who had been wronged and had nothing left to lose. A widow whose land had been seized, a servant who had been unjustly dismissed, a lover who had been abandoned. These individuals were believed to possess a special power born of righteous anger, and their curses were considered almost impossible to break. The methods of casting curses were varied and often surprisingly specific. Some involved the creation of wax or clay figures representing the intended victim. These effigies would be pierced with pins, buried in graveyards, or subjected to various forms of symbolic torture. Others used personal items belonging to the target, hair, nail clippings, or pieces of clothing that could create a magical connection between the curse and its victim. Verbal curses were considered especially powerful because they involved the spoken word, which medieval people believed had inherent magical properties. A well-crafted curse, delivered with sufficient anger and specificity, was thought to be nearly unstoppable. Some of the most feared curses were those that invoked divine authority, calling upon God, saints, or angels to witness and enforce the punishment. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of a curse belief was the idea that curses could be inherited. A curse placed on one person could affect their children, their grandchildren, or even their entire bloodline. This created a world where the sins and conflicts of previous generations could continue to cause suffering for decades or even centuries. The breaking of curses required specialized knowledge and often elaborate rituals. Some could be neutralized through confession and penance, particularly if the curse had been deserved. Others required the services of professional curse breakers, individuals who specialized in identifying and countering supernatural attacks. These practitioners often used combinations of prayer, herbal remedies, and counter magic to undo the effects of malevolent spells. And then there were the omens. Medieval people lived in a world where everything was potentially significant, where the behavior of animals, the weather, and random events could all be messages from the supernatural realm. Reading these signs correctly could mean the difference between life and death, success and failure, salvation and damnation. Birds were considered especially important sources of omenic information. The direction of their flight, the species involved, the time of day, and the number of birds all carried different meanings. Ravens were particularly significant because of their association with death and battlefields. A raven landing on your roof wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a warning that death was approaching your household. But it wasn't just the presence of ravens that mattered. The way they behaved was crucial. A raven that circled a house 3 times before landing was considered a more serious omen than one that simply perched briefly and flew away. Ravens that called out while looking directly at a person were delivering a personal message. And a group of ravens gathering in unusual numbers was a sign of impending disaster for the entire community. Other animals carried their own ominous significance. Owls hooting during daylight hours indicated that someone in the area would die before sunset. Cats behaving strangely, particularly if they refused to enter a house or seemed to be staring at empty spaces, suggested the presence of evil spirits. Dogs howling without apparent cause was a sign that death was approaching, and the duration of the howling could indicate how many people would be affected. But omens weren't limited to animal behavior. The weather could also carry supernatural messages. Sudden changes in wind direction, particularly during important events, were considered significant. Rain falling during a funeral was generally seen as a good sign, indicating that the deceased's soul had been welcomed into heaven. But rain during a wedding was more ambiguous, potentially signifying either purification or future troubles. Natural phenomena were especially powerful omens. Eclipses, comets, and unusual cloud formations were all considered messages from God or warnings of impending catastrophe. The appearance of a comet was often interpreted as a sign that a great leader would die or that a significant war was approaching. Strange lights in the sky could indicate anything from divine favor to demonic activity. Even everyday objects could become omenic. A candle that flickered without any apparent cause might indicate the presence of spirits. A mirror that cracked spontaneously was often seen as a warning of death. Bread that failed to rise properly could suggest that the household was under supernatural attack. The interpretation of omens required considerable skill and knowledge. Different regions had different traditions, and the same sign might have completely different meanings depending on local customs. This created a thriving industry of professional omen readers, individuals who specialized in decoding the supernatural messages that surrounded daily life. But perhaps the most anxiety-inducing aspect of omen belief was the responsibility it placed on individuals. If you correctly interpreted an omen and took appropriate action, you might avoid disaster. But if you misread the signs or failed to respond properly, the consequences could be catastrophic. This created a world where people lived in constant fear of missing important supernatural communications. The pressure to correctly interpret omens extended to entire communities. Village leaders were expected to recognize signs of impending problems and take appropriate action. Farmers needed to understand agricultural omens to ensure successful harvests. Merchants had to read the signs before making important business decisions, and everyone was expected to recognize omens related to death, disease, and disaster. This brings us to one of the most pervasive and disturbing aspects of medieval supernatural belief: the idea that the dead weren't really gone. They were just invisible, and under the right circumstances they could become visible again. Medieval people lived in a world where the boundary between life and death was permeable, where the deceased continued to exist in a parallel realm that occasionally intersected with the world of the living. This wasn't just about ghosts in the modern sense. Medieval people believed in a complex hierarchy of post-death existence. There were the souls in heaven, who were generally too busy enjoying eternal bliss to bother with earthly concerns. There were the souls in hell, who were fortunately trapped and unable to return. But there were also the souls in purgatory, and these were the ones that caused problems. Purgatory was conceptualized as a temporary state where souls underwent purification before being admitted to heaven. But the process could take a very long time, potentially thousands of years. And during this period, the souls retained connections to the earthly world. They could still care about their former lives, worry about their families, and feel compelled to resolve unfinished business. This created the possibility of ongoing relationships between the living and the dead. A deceased parent might return to offer advice to their children. A dead spouse could visit to provide comfort or warnings. A former friend might appear to request prayers, or to reveal the location of hidden valuables. These weren't necessarily frightening encounters, but they were always significant, and often deeply emotional. But not all post-death visitations were benevolent. Some souls returned because they were angry, either about their deaths or about things that had happened after they died. A person who had been murdered might return to identify their killer. Someone who had been cheated out of their inheritance could come back to seek justice. And individuals who had died with serious sins on their souls might return as warnings to the living. The timing of these visitations followed certain patterns. The dead were most likely to appear during the first few days after their death, as their souls were still closely connected to their former lives. They might also return on significant anniversaries, particularly the date of their death or important religious holidays. And they were especially likely to appear to people who had been emotionally close to them in life. The locations of these encounters were also predictable. The dead often appeared in places that had been important to them in life, their former homes, their workplaces, or the locations where they had died. Churches and graveyards were common sites for visitations, as were crossroads, which were considered places where the boundaries between worlds were thin. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval belief about the dead was the idea that they could be summoned. Certain individuals, particularly those with knowledge of necromancy, were believed to be capable of calling up the deceased and compelling them to provide information or services. This wasn't just theoretical. Medieval legal records include actual cases of people being accused of consulting with the dead. The practice of necromancy was considered one of the most serious forms of forbidden magic. Unlike other types of supernatural activity, which might be motivated by desperation or ignorance, necromancy was seen as a deliberate attempt to gain power through communication with forces that should remain separate from the living world. The penalties for necromancy were severe, often including death. But the fear of necromancy wasn't just about the legal consequences. Medieval people believed that summoning the dead was inherently dangerous for both the practitioner and the community. The process of calling up a soul could potentially release other, more malevolent entities. A necromancer who lost control of a summoned spirit might find themselves possessed or killed by their own magic. And the very act of forcing the dead to return could anger God and bring divine punishment upon an entire region. This brings us to one of the most complex and frightening aspects of medieval supernatural belief: the idea that certain individuals could, either deliberately or accidentally, serve as conduits between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These people weren't necessarily practicing necromancy, but they seemed to attract supernatural attention in ways that made them both valuable and dangerous to their communities. Some individuals appeared to have natural psychic abilities that allowed them to see or communicate with the dead without consciously summoning them. These people might report regular visitations from deceased relatives, or they might claim to receive messages from souls in purgatory. While such abilities could be seen as gifts, they also made their possessors objects of suspicion and fear. Children were considered particularly susceptible to supernatural influences. Their innocence was believed to make them more spiritually sensitive, but it also made them more vulnerable to malevolent forces. A child who claimed to see invisible people or who spoke to empty rooms might be experiencing genuine supernatural encounters, but they might also be under demonic influence. The identification of supernaturally sensitive individuals created complex social dynamics. On one hand, such people could be valuable to their communities as sources of information about the supernatural realm. They might be able to identify cursed objects, locate missing persons by consulting with the dead, or provide warnings about impending supernatural threats. On the other hand, their abilities made them potentially dangerous, and they might find themselves blamed for any supernatural problems that occurred in their vicinity. This ambivalence toward supernaturally gifted individuals extended to the broader question of how communities should respond to supernatural threats. Medieval people lived in constant tension between the desire to protect themselves from supernatural dangers and the fear that their protective measures might accidentally make things worse. For example, the use of protective charms and amulets was widely accepted and encouraged by religious authorities. But there was always the risk that a charm might be ineffective, or, worse, that it might actually attract the attention of malevolent forces. A person wearing the wrong type of protective jewelry might find themselves more vulnerable to supernatural attack, not less. Similarly, the practice of blessing objects, homes, and people was considered essential for spiritual protection. But improper blessings, or blessings performed by individuals who weren't spiritually pure, could potentially have negative effects. A corrupted blessing might not only fail to provide protection, but could actually serve as an invitation to demonic forces. The complexity of these beliefs created a world where people lived in constant anxiety about their spiritual state and their vulnerability to supernatural attack. Every decision, from what to wear to how to arrange furniture, carried potential supernatural consequences. Every encounter with an unusual person or event required careful evaluation to determine whether supernatural forces were involved. And this brings us to perhaps the most exhausting aspect of medieval supernatural belief: the sheer amount of mental energy required to navigate daily life safely. Medieval people didn't just worry about practical concerns like food, shelter, and physical safety. They also had to constantly monitor their spiritual condition, interpret supernatural signs, maintain protective rituals, and avoid behaviors that might attract malevolent attention. The morning routine alone required multiple supernatural precautions. Upon waking, a person was expected to immediately say a prayer of thanks for surviving the night. The clothes they chose to wear needed to include appropriate protective items. The food they ate for breakfast had to be blessed to prevent it from being used against them by curse casters. And the route they took to their daily activities needed to avoid locations known to be spiritually dangerous. Throughout the day, every interaction with other people required assessment for potential supernatural risks. A friendly greeting from a neighbor might be genuine, or it might be an attempt to gather personal information for use in magical attacks. A compliment about one's appearance or possessions could be sincere, or it might be a form of evil eye assault. Even casual conversations needed to be carefully monitored to avoid revealing information that could be used against oneself. The evening routine was even more complex. Before retiring to bed, a medieval person was expected to review the day's events for signs of supernatural influence. Any unusual occurrences needed to be analyzed and, if necessary, counteracted through prayer, protective rituals, or consultations with spiritual advisors. The bedroom itself required preparation, including the placement of protective objects, the recitation of specific prayers, and the performance of cleansing rituals. But perhaps the most mentally exhausting aspect of medieval supernatural belief was the constant need to interpret events in terms of their spiritual significance. A successful harvest wasn't just the result of good weather and hard work. It was also a sign of divine favor that needed to be properly acknowledged through prayers and offerings. A failed business venture wasn't just bad luck. It was potentially the result of supernatural attack that required investigation and response. This intensive spiritual vigilance created a world where people lived in constant awareness of invisible forces and potential threats. It was mentally and emotionally exhausting, but it was also considered absolutely essential for survival. The alternative, spiritual carelessness, could result in anything from minor misfortunes to eternal damnation. And yet, despite all of these fears and precautions, medieval people somehow managed to sleep. They developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to function in a world that was absolutely saturated with supernatural threats. They created communities of mutual support where neighbors helped each other interpret omens and maintain protective practices. They established traditions and rituals that provided structure and comfort in the face of cosmic uncertainty. Most importantly, they developed a worldview that, while terrifying, was also deeply meaningful. In a universe where everything was connected to spiritual forces, every action mattered. Every decision had cosmic significance. Every person was part of a vast spiritual drama that connected the earthly world to the realm of the divine. The medieval belief in supernatural forces wasn't just about fear. It was also about hope. In a world where invisible powers could bring destruction, they could also bring protection, healing, and salvation. The same spiritual realm that contained demons and curses also contained angels and blessings. The key was learning to navigate this realm safely and to align oneself with the forces of good rather than evil. This complex spiritual worldview provided medieval people with a framework for understanding and responding to the challenges of their lives. It offered explanations for inexplicable events, methods for protecting against dangers both visible and invisible, and hope for ultimate justice and redemption. It was a comprehensive system of belief that addressed not just religious questions but practical concerns about health, safety, prosperity, and social relationships. In the end, the weird medieval superstitions that kept people up at night weren't just random fears. They were part of a sophisticated, if sometimes terrifying, attempt to understand and control a world that was full of genuine dangers and genuine mysteries. These beliefs provided structure, meaning, and community in a time when life was often brutal, short, and unpredictable. The legacy of these beliefs extends far beyond the medieval period. Many of the supernatural fears that terrified our ancestors continue to influence modern culture. From horror movies to urban legends to contemporary conspiracy theories. The human need to explain the unexplainable and to protect against invisible threats remains as strong today as it was 1,000 years ago. Perhaps that's the most unsettling thing about medieval superstitions. They weren't the product of ignorant or primitive minds. They were the logical response of intelligent people trying to make sense of a world that was genuinely mysterious and often genuinely dangerous. In their own way, these beliefs worked. They provided comfort, community, and a sense of control in an uncontrollable world. And on those nights when you lie awake, listening to strange sounds and wondering about the shadows in the corners of your room, you might find yourself understanding exactly why medieval people believed in things that went bump in the night. Because sometimes, in the darkness, it's easier to believe in demons than to accept that the world is random, that bad things happen for no reason, and that we're all just making our way through an uncertain existence without any supernatural guidance or protection. At least demons can be fought off with prayers and protective charms. Random chaos is much harder to defend against. Maybe that's why medieval superstitions still have the power to keep us up at night, even now, centuries after we've supposedly outgrown them. Because deep down, in the darkest hours before dawn, we still understand the fear that created them, and we still feel the human need for meaning, protection, and hope in a world that often seems determined to provide none of these things. So the next time you find yourself checking the locks on your doors before bed, or avoiding that dark corner of your bedroom, or feeling inexplicably uneasy during the hours between midnight and dawn, remember that you're participating in a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. You're experiencing the same fundamental human anxieties that kept medieval people awake, listening for supernatural threats and hoping that morning would come quickly. The difference is that we have electric lights to push back the darkness, modern medicine to explain mysterious illnesses, and scientific understanding to account for strange phenomena. But we still have the imagination to wonder what might be lurking just beyond the edge of our perception. And we still have the very human need to believe that there's more to existence than what we can see and touch and measure. In that sense, we're not so different from those medieval people who lay awake, terrified of the wild hunt and nightmares and revenants. We're all just trying to make it through the night in a world that's full of mysteries, and we're all hoping that whatever protective measures we've put in place will be enough to keep the darkness at bay until morning comes again. But there's another layer to these medieval fears that makes them even more fascinating and disturbing. The superstitions weren't just individual anxieties. They were collective obsessions that shaped entire societies, influenced political decisions, and even determined the outcomes of wars and economic policies. When an entire civilization believes that supernatural forces are constantly interfering in human affairs, every aspect of life becomes a potential battleground between the forces of good and evil. Consider how these beliefs affected medieval justice systems. Courts didn't just rely on evidence and testimony. They also considered supernatural signs when determining guilt or innocence. A defendant who showed signs of divine favor, perhaps through miraculous healing or unusual good luck, might be acquitted regardless of the evidence against them. Conversely, someone who experienced a run of bad fortune might be convicted based on the assumption that God was punishing them for their crimes. Trial by ordeal was perhaps the most dramatic example of supernatural justice. Accused individuals might be required to carry red-hot iron, plunge their hands into boiling water, or undergo other painful tests. The theory was that God would protect the innocent and allow the guilty to be harmed. From a modern perspective, this seems barbaric and irrational. But from a medieval perspective, it made perfect sense. If supernatural forces were constantly active in human affairs, why wouldn't they intervene to ensure that justice was served? The belief in supernatural intervention extended far beyond the courtroom. Medieval military commanders regularly consulted omens before making strategic decisions. The behavior of birds, the direction of the wind, the appearance of unusual cloud formations, all of these could influence whether an army advanced or retreated. Battles were sometimes postponed or relocated based on supernatural signs, and the outcomes of conflicts were often interpreted as evidence of divine favor or disfavor. This created a world where political power was intimately connected to spiritual authority. A king who consistently experienced good omens was seen as blessed by God and therefore legitimate. A ruler who suffered a series of supernatural setbacks might find their authority questioned and their throne threatened. The ability to correctly interpret supernatural signs became a crucial political skill, and rulers often kept professional omen readers and spiritual advisors as part of their inner circles. The economic implications of medieval superstition were equally profound. Merchants didn't just worry about practical concerns like weather, bandits, and market conditions. They also had to consider supernatural factors that might affect their business ventures. A trader who experienced a series of bad omens might postpone a major expedition, potentially missing out on profitable opportunities. Conversely, someone who received positive supernatural signs might take risks that seemed foolish from a purely practical perspective. Agricultural communities were particularly dependent on supernatural guidance. Farmers consulted omens to determine when to plant and harvest crops. They performed rituals to ensure good weather and to protect their fields from supernatural threats. The success or failure of harvests was often attributed to the community's spiritual condition rather than to purely natural factors. A village that experienced crop failures might conclude that they had somehow offended God, or that they were under supernatural attack from a neighboring community. This interconnection between the supernatural and the practical created a world where expertise in spiritual matters was just as valuable as expertise in worldly affairs. Professional wise women, cunning folk, and spiritual advisors occupied important positions in medieval society. These individuals combined practical knowledge with supernatural insights, offering services that ranged from medical treatment to weather prediction to protection against magical attacks. But the influence of supernatural belief wasn't limited to formal practitioners. Every medieval person was expected to possess at least basic knowledge of spiritual protection and supernatural interpretation. Children learned protective prayers along with their letters. Apprentices absorbed supernatural lore along with their trade skills. Even the most practical and down-to-earth individuals maintained an arsenal of protective charms, lucky objects, and ritual practices. The social pressure to maintain proper spiritual vigilance was enormous. A person who neglected their protective rituals or who failed to recognize important omens could endanger not just themselves, but their entire community. This created a system of mutual surveillance where neighbors monitored each other for signs of spiritual carelessness or suspicious supernatural activity. The accusations that could result from this surveillance were devastating. Someone who experienced unusual good luck might be accused of making deals with demonic forces. A person whose neighbors consistently suffered misfortunes might be labeled as a curse caster or evil eye practitioner. Even innocent behaviors could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural involvement. A woman who talked to her cats might be accused of consulting with demonic familiars. A man who walked alone at night might be suspected of attending supernatural gatherings. These accusations created a climate of fear and suspicion that permeated medieval communities. People were careful about how they behaved, what they said, and even how they looked at others. The wrong expression at the wrong moment could trigger accusations that might destroy a person's reputation, livelihood, or even their life. This social dynamic reinforced the belief system by making supernatural explanations for everyday problems, both plausible and socially necessary. The gender dynamics of medieval superstition were particularly complex and troubling. Women were generally considered more susceptible to supernatural influences, both positive and negative. This meant that they were often sought out for their spiritual insights and healing abilities, but they were also more likely to be accused of malevolent magical practices. The same knowledge that made a woman valuable as a midwife or herbalist could also make her dangerous as a potential witch. The association between women and supernatural knowledge wasn't entirely negative. Many communities relied on wise women for services that combined practical skills with spiritual protection. These women might serve as midwives, healers, matchmakers, and spiritual advisors. Their knowledge of herbs, charms, and protective rituals made them essential members of their communities. But this same knowledge also made them vulnerable to accusations when things went wrong. The medieval obsession with virginity and purity was closely connected to supernatural beliefs. Virgin women were considered particularly powerful in spiritual matters, capable of performing miracles and providing protection against evil forces. But this power was fragile and could be lost through sexual activity, anger, or other forms of spiritual corruption. The pressure on women to maintain their spiritual purity was enormous, and the consequences of failure could be catastrophic. Men weren't immune to supernatural suspicions, but their vulnerabilities were different. Male practitioners of supernatural arts were often viewed as more deliberately evil than their female counterparts. While women might be seen as victims of demonic influence, or as individuals who had been corrupted by forces beyond their control, men who practiced magic were more likely to be portrayed as willing servants of evil who had consciously chosen to align themselves with demonic powers. The clerical establishment occupied a complex position within this supernatural landscape. On one hand, the church was the primary source of spiritual protection and the ultimate authority on supernatural matters. Priests provided blessed objects, performed protective rituals, and offered guidance on spiritual dangers. On the other hand, the church also competed with folk practitioners and often sought to suppress or control supernatural practices that occurred outside of official religious channels. This tension created a complicated relationship between official religious doctrine and popular supernatural belief. The church officially condemned many folk practices as superstitious or heretical, but it also absorbed and reinterpreted many of these beliefs within a Christian framework. The result was a hybrid system where Christian prayers and rituals coexisted with older protective practices, often in ways that made little theological sense but provided emotional comfort and social cohesion. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life were deeply intertwined with supernatural beliefs. Certain times of year were considered particularly dangerous from a spiritual perspective. The 12 days of Christmas were a time when the boundaries between worlds were thin and supernatural creatures were especially active. All Hallows' Eve marked the beginning of a period when the dead could more easily return to the world of the living. The summer solstice was associated with powerful magical forces that could be either beneficial or harmful, depending on how they were approached. These seasonal supernatural cycles created a calendar of spiritual obligations and precautions that structured medieval life as much as agricultural and religious observances. Communities would prepare for dangerous supernatural periods by increasing their protective rituals, avoiding risky behaviors, and maintaining heightened vigilance. The approach of a spiritually dangerous season could create community-wide anxiety that affected everything from travel plans to business decisions. The physical landscape of medieval Europe was also shaped by supernatural beliefs. Certain locations were considered inherently spiritual, either blessed or cursed, and these designations affected how people lived and worked. Crossroads were particularly significant because they were believed to be places where different worlds intersected. Churches were often built at crossroads to provide spiritual protection, but crossroads were also associated with demonic activity and were common sites for supernatural encounters. Water features had their own supernatural significance. Springs, wells, and rivers were often considered sacred and were associated with healing powers or protective spirits. But water could also be dangerous from a supernatural perspective. Certain bodies of water were believed to be haunted by drowned spirits or to serve as gateways to the underworld. Travelers were careful about which water sources they used and often performed protective rituals before crossing rivers or streams. Forests occupied a special place in the medieval supernatural landscape. These were liminal spaces where the rules of civilized society didn't fully apply and where supernatural creatures were most likely to be encountered. The deep woods were home to dangerous spirits, malevolent fairies, and other entities that could harm unwary travelers. But forests were also sources of powerful magical materials and were sometimes the only places where certain protective rituals could be properly performed. The built environment reflected these supernatural concerns in subtle but important ways. Houses were designed and decorated with spiritual protection in mind. Iron objects were incorporated into construction to ward off evil spirits. Religious symbols were carved into door frames and windowsills. Even the orientation of buildings could be influenced by supernatural considerations, with doors and windows positioned to prevent the entry of malevolent forces. The development of medieval medicine was profoundly influenced by supernatural beliefs. Physicians didn't just treat symptoms, they also addressed the spiritual causes of illness. A patient suffering from unexplained fatigue might be treated with herbs and bloodletting, but the physician would also investigate whether the illness was caused by curses, evil eye attacks, or other supernatural factors. The most effective medical practitioners were those who could combine practical treatments with spiritual healing. This integration of medicine and magic created a healthcare system that addressed both physical and spiritual needs. Patients received not just medical treatment, but also protective charms, blessed objects, and spiritual counseling. The healing process involved not just the restoration of physical health, but also the correction of spiritual imbalances that might have contributed to the illness. The training of medical practitioners reflected this dual approach. Physicians studied not just anatomy and herbal remedies, but also astrology, spiritual protection, and the supernatural causes of disease. The most prestigious medical schools taught courses on magical theory alongside conventional medical subjects. A well-educated physician was expected to be as knowledgeable about curses and evil spirits as about broken bones and infected wounds. The pharmaceutical practices of medieval medicine were deeply influenced by supernatural beliefs. The effectiveness of herbal remedies was believed to depend not just on their chemical properties, but also on when and how they were gathered, the spiritual condition of the person preparing them, and the magical words or rituals that accompanied their use. A simple headache remedy might require herbs gathered under specific astrological conditions, prepared by a spiritually pure individual, and administered while reciting protective prayers. This supernatural approach to medicine created a healthcare system that was both more holistic and more complicated than modern medicine. Patients received treatment for their spiritual as well as physical ailments, but they also faced the risk that their illnesses might be attributed to moral failings or supernatural attacks rather than to natural causes. The success or failure of medical treatment was often interpreted as evidence of the patient's spiritual condition rather than the effectiveness of the therapy. The educational systems of medieval Europe were also shaped by supernatural beliefs. Children didn't just learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. They also absorbed extensive knowledge about spiritual protection, supernatural threats, and the proper interpretation of omens. This education began in infancy and continued throughout childhood, creating adults who were thoroughly versed in supernatural lore and defensive practices. The curriculum of medieval education included both formal instruction and informal learning. Children learned protective prayers and rituals from their parents and religious instructors. They absorbed supernatural knowledge through stories, songs, and community traditions. By adulthood, most people possessed a comprehensive understanding of the supernatural landscape and the skills necessary to navigate it safely. But this education also created significant anxiety and psychological pressure. Children grew up in a world where invisible threats were considered real and immediate. They learned to live in constant awareness of supernatural dangers and to maintain perpetual vigilance against spiritual attacks. The psychological toll of this lifestyle was enormous, contributing to the high levels of anxiety and superstitious behavior that characterized medieval society. The artistic and literary traditions of medieval Europe reflected and reinforced supernatural beliefs. Stories, songs, and visual art didn't just entertain. They also transmitted essential information about spiritual dangers and protective practices. The most popular tales were those that taught audiences how to recognize and respond to supernatural threats. These narratives served as both entertainment and education, helping to maintain the knowledge necessary for spiritual survival. The visual arts of the medieval period were saturated with supernatural imagery. Church decorations included detailed depictions of demons, angels, and other spiritual entities. Manuscripts were illustrated with scenes of supernatural encounters and spiritual battles. Even everyday objects like tools and household items were decorated with protective symbols and religious imagery. This artistic tradition created a visual environment that constantly reinforced supernatural beliefs. Medieval people lived surrounded by images that reminded them of invisible spiritual realities. These visual cues served as constant reminders of the need for spiritual vigilance and the reality of supernatural threats. The literary traditions of medieval Europe served similar functions. Epic poems, romantic stories, and moral tales all included supernatural elements that reflected contemporary beliefs and concerns. These narratives didn't just describe imaginary worlds. They portrayed the spiritual landscape that medieval people believed they actually inhabited. The monsters, magic, and supernatural encounters in medieval literature were understood as realistic depictions of possible experiences rather than as pure fantasy.